Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight in the Balie for the program How Wars End. It's boiling hot outside. Again, thanks for being here. Well, for that same reason, one of our speakers tonight, Linda Kinstler, was unable to join us. Tonight's topic is what happens after war? How do societies continue after atrocities have occurred? And we will start today's program with some opening remarks she wrote to have her voice still at the table in a way, which we might reflect on later. So I would like to ask my colleague Brit.
Hello, everyone. To speak of what happens after atrocity is itself a provocation, given that for survivors of grave crimes there's no after to speak of. The catastrophe continues well after the final shots are fired. It lives on in the devastation of families, homes, histories and archives. The world around them, politicians, lawyers, judges, may be eager to proclaim that a conflict has ceased and a much heralded period of peacemaking has arrived. But for those on the ground, these proclamations are often understood as theater pieces and legal fictions. The effect is that survivors are often trapped in many temporalities at once, living through the supposed aftermath of devastation, even while in their communities and even in their own bodies, the atrocities continue. Much of my work over the past several years has been dedicated to understanding what we mean when we speak of the aftermath of atrocity. I've written about how, in our current moment, ceasefires have become a stand-in for lasting peace settlements, which to my mind reflects a distinct political pessimism about the possibility of a real end to conflict. All over the world, temporary breaks in hostilities are used to hold violence at bay. We no longer have the political will to address their root causes and thus prevent violence from breaking out once more. Today, we live in what the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung called negative peace, in which there is no large-scale physical violence yet, also no resolution to the world's cascading conflicts. This is the kind of peace that ceasefires and truces can produce, a peace without justice. For the political theorist Murat Idris, this condition can also be a more honest peace, because it does not aspire to deliver anything more than a stop to the killing, does not promise anything more than a brief reprieve. Fragile and fleeting by design, these measures reject what he describes as the pretense of permanence and certainty. They do not pretend to offer a durable solution or a perpetual peace, do not hold out hope for legal reckonings that may never come. They acknowledge, by their very grammar, what peacekeepers all over the world have long known. Often, the absence of violence is the best you can hope for. But this, of course, is not a satisfying solution. We, who are invested in the pursuit of truth and justice, are loath to accept the disappointments of negative peace. So the question remains, how ought we to balance the need for accountability with the awful fact that today's wars do not lend themselves easily to transitional justice mechanisms such as special military tribunals or truth and reconciliation commissions? And even if they did, how might we improve on the historical models of transitional justice that we have inherited? If the possibility of legal reckoning is taken off the table, what other modes of redress might we be able to support? Creating registers of damages and claims committees is one constructive response, but what else might follow? And more broadly, how might the deferral of justice today, I think emblematized in the debate over the special tribunal for the crime of aggression in Ukraine, alter societal perceptions of and investments in law and politics? These are among the questions that we might address in our conversation today.
Is it? Thank you, Brit. So we live in a war where we live in a world where wars seem to end without really ending. In Gaza, we see an ongoing genocide under a supposed ceasefire. Lives are lost, and the destruction is still being counted. after the fall of the Assad regime, Syrians now need to decide whether they want to reckon with the horrors of the past decade, open that archive or leave it closed. In the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, tribunals ran for 20 years while society had to re-establish itself. And Europe, that is living in its own shadow, in the shadow of its own grim history of the Second World War, now has a new war going on this continent, in Ukraine. So the shooting might stop, but does this mean that the war also ends? Tonight we ask what comes after atrocity, mass murder, or genocide, when families are broken or even erased, and when victims and perpetrators go on living side by side. How does a society go on after the unspeakable? Do we bury the past in oblivion or dig up its contested histories in search of justice? To tackle these questions, I am joined by three wonderful speakers. First, Olaf Koens, who is a journalist who has reported extensively on war, justice, reconciliation across the globe. And then Eva Vukušić, assistant professor of international history at Utrecht University and a scholar of war crimes and the people who commit them. And Professor Ihab Saloul, professor of memory and heritage studies at the University of Amsterdam and co-founder and director of the Amsterdam School for Heritage, Memory and Material Culture. Give them a warm welcome, please. My name is Senna Felius, and I am the moderator tonight. We will start with a panel discussion and close with a Q&A. This program is live streamed, which you should keep in mind when you ask a question, because as in court, everything you say might be used against you one day, and you'll be archived on the Balie TV. So let's start with a very simple question, and I would like all of your answers. Why is it so important that we're having this conversation on how war ends, on what comes after atrocity today? Maybe Eva, maybe you could start.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me. So when I think about why is it important to talk about the past and about the atrocities, I'm going to maybe start by speaking not necessarily as a scholar, but as a former Yugoslav. I was 10 years old when my country blew up in flames in the former Yugoslavia. And I realized the war was over when I was 14. I realized the first time that I had to vote in elections that the history was influencing my today. So history's influence our present. And I think in many ways we cannot understand what is going on in our societies if we, in this way or that way, don't acknowledge sort of our history. So this is also something that I think fits well with me being a historian. But apart from that, this influence on the today and on the present, I think it's also really important. We live in a world, we share it with other people, and I think it's crucial that we acknowledge harm, even if nobody goes to jail, even if sort of political solutions are not ideal. I think this acknowledgement of harm is something that we own, or that we owe our other fellow humans.
Thank you. So history informing the present day and acknowledging harm. Yeah, what would you say?
Thank you very much for having me here. Yeah, I would say actually that the past is never past. So the idea that we move beyond the past is very difficult to understand. William Faulkner already told us this. But I think maybe why this topic is important, it's not important to understand how wars end. I don't think that wars end, but rather they transform and they take different shapes. But it's also important to understand how war happened, how war in their transformation also influence human life in various ways. You can't say that the whole conflict in European conflicts, the Middle Age wars, or even the other kind of past, the Napoleonic wars, have ended. We have seen what we live in is a kind of a soundbite of that past, and that kind of past already shaped some of our present and will shape our future. So eventually, this talk is a kind of an endless talk for me.
So past, yeah. Present, and future are all scrambled, and wars don't end. Is that?
History doesn't end in so many ways. And for me, it was other than you both of you are esteemed scholars. I'm just a very simple writer. I ended up in Russia in a time when Russia was fun and it was an upcoming economy. First time I came there in 2006, 2007, and there was an idea that yes, they carried a sense, a terrible past with an incredible amount of violence, but there was an overall conception that we can just kind of leave that behind. It's fine. We don't need to talk about it, and eventually that led to where we are now. And I grew convinced of the fact that if you don't face your history, if you don't face the past, then you will never learn anything about the future. And it's also a reckoning I've seen in myself, because I remember those days very well when the Russians said like, yeah, sure, some stuff happened. So there was a common conception of we don't need to talk about the future because we don't need to talk about the past because the future is already uncertain enough. But I am afraid that we are all witnessing now the consequence of that. That's kind of why I think this topic is very important to talk about.
And Olaf, I would like to continue with you, because as a journalist, you document the now, the present. Mm-hmm. Why is it so important to document atrocities as a journalist in 2026? God, I can give you the, there's a cliche where journalists are the first writers of history, blah blah blah. I don't necessarily buy that much, but I think it's important to show and to give a sense, at least a partial sense of understanding of what happens in our world and what. But so, if you're not the first drafter of history, what are you then?
First bystander.
Okay.
Definitely not a drafter, I would say. But in some cases, yes, it is important to document, to show what's going on. And I'm not saying we're doing a great job. In fact, I think that the genocide in Gaza shows that we're not. But in some cases, maybe journalism is useful in that sense, and I think it's, a part of it is bearing witness. And I'm not an academic, so my position as a journalist or as a writer is usually to I'm just trying to grasp certain things. I'm trying to understand that. I'm very much aware of the fact that I'm somewhere in another country, far away, not because I'm interested in it myself. Also, but mostly because I need to explain this to our viewers, our readers, and sometimes you have to cut some corners there. But I'd like to think that getting an idea of what happens there, getting the feeling of what it means. I mean, I've there's so many things I can think of, but I've documented some of the mass graves in Ukraine that were dug up after the Ukrainian army in 2022 liberated a part of territory that was formerly occupied by the Russians, and I don't have any. That doesn't have any historical meaning. My reporting is not used for reconciliation or anything else.
Well, I'm curious about that, actually.
But it does, at least, for my mother who watches TV, it gives a sense of what's going on. And if I can show, if I can feel, I don't know, even the emotions of the people who have to dig up the graves of their friends and relatives, if I can show only a part of a sliver of that emotion, then I think I'm at least doing a part of my job.
Okay. Because Eva, you are a historian and you're also a specialist on courts, and I saw you nodding quite a bit. What do you think the role of documentations are in tribunals? You've worked on the criminal tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. In The Hague. What are your reflections on that?
Right. So, again, I think it depends sort of a little bit where we start from. But as a historian, I would say that's our sources for the future. People are going to be able to write books. And I think that's also important because in many ways, a lot of the processes that come from courts are not satisfactory. Many victims are left out, their cases are never heard. So I see documentation and writing, and I wrote a book about paramilitaries in the former Yugoslavia. I mentioned specific survivors and victims by name. And in some ways, I also think that it's a way of leaving it for posterity, that there's a record of something happening, right? So I think that's really an important element of it. But I think journalists in the former Yugoslavia, but also in many other places, were actually called upon to testify about what they've seen, and that's an ethical debate. Some journalists want to do it and some don't. But actually it's really important because they're often the only people on the ground or soon after sort of a case of an incident of mass atrocity happening. But just as a final point, why is it important? And I think also in contemporary times, especially since the war in Syria, so in 2011, and also then especially after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, documentation, especially by civil society, has been massive. The state of the Netherlands has invested money in it. The UK has invested money in it. There is this sense of collecting, and there's some problems that we can potentially come back to later if people are interested. But there's a sense of, let's record this. Who knows? Maybe a judicial proceeding, maybe claims for reparations, maybe books need to be written, maybe novels and documentary films. But there's a sense of we have to capture this moment and the injustice of it so that something can come out of it. It's almost like we can't do much else, right? They're bombing us, we're surviving all this stuff. Let's document as also a sense of taking some destiny into your own hands.
And Ihab, how do you reflect on that? The bearing witness, what would you say, keeping destiny in your own hand through documentation?
Good question. I think that's a philosophical question. I hope my answer you will appreciate that or not, I'm not sure. But let me put it this way. Newsmaking and news reporting are not history making. They are contributing towards history making, but they are not history per se. So that's important. The second thing is that history as we understand it should not be over-exaggerated as a term, because as a historian, I know what you're saying, but I think history itself, basically the academic practice of it, eventually it comes down to be actually a memory. It's a memory seen through documents, while memory actually is history seen through emotions. So this is the simplest explanation of history for me. Now that's one aspect of how do we explain the concept. However, the concept is overloaded still, because actually many people take the notion of history as a sacred, like as if we know the past, we can count Rome, Napoleon, Middle Ages, etc. But this is not actually history what we have. What we have is what we call historiography. It's a making of a history, or the writing of history is different from what history is. So that's an important distinction we need to make. Because simply history is part of it, a large chunk of it is the notion of selection. Just the whole idea of what we select. We select certain episodes and we highlight them and we say, okay, this is what constitutes our Dutch history or our French history, etc. So it's all a matter of selective process and agency that plays a role in that. So I think it's good to understand how these kind of processes, of course, they overlap and they also influence each other, these kind of social processes of the making of history, or what we call history. But it includes an active agency behind this process. And so there is a maker of this kind of what we call history.
So let's make that concrete. Who is that maker?
We are the makers, all of us. But actually, there's also a kind of a canon. That's another important issue. Why Shakespeare is appreciated, why Rembrandt is appreciated. You can find a lot of other better Rembrandts, but we already decided we want this Rembrandt.
Better Rembrandts, I think this is
for
the most controversial thing you will say tonight.
Okay, or better Van Gogh, or I mean, you can already select who do you want. That's what I mean. I mean, the choice of making that kind of selection, of course, it can be arbitrary, it can be motivated, etc., but it doesn't hide the fact that somebody already selected that for us, and then we brought it into our discourse, and that's how it became part of the canon.
So the selection of stories worth telling
If I may, also just a small point that I think links to this very well. It's also about sources, which sources are available and which are not, whose stories are told and whose stories are not told. Yep. My colleagues that work on, for example, slavery and colonialism, the story is often told from the perspective of the colonizer, because the people who were subjected to this regime were not named by name and their stories recorded, right? So there's also fancy French theory about all of that, but I think there's also a lot of power, right, in who saves what and what then historians 200 years later have to work with, right? So I think that's also an important element to what we're talking about.
Yeah,
exactly. And if I may add, I think also not just the whole terminology or the concept of history, but also what we can use of it and what we put it in practice. For example, also think about our schools and what our children, like you get a history exam, you need to answer in what the book says, and you can't come up with alternative words. So you can't call this country a different name, then you fail the exam, you see? So it's already a kind of, not just a social process, but also a kind of ingrained, a mental process that we also try to strengthen and also put in people's head as taken for granted.
Okay, let's try to bring this to a concrete situation and try to drag history and the process of history making to experience. Olaf, I think you might have an interesting answer to this question. What happens when history isn't written? Have you ever encountered a place where history was just left after?
What a question. Sure, many. I think you're referring to in the Soviet Union, of course, there was the Gulag, the massive Stalinist repression camps, where hundreds of thousands of people have perished, and they were scattered around the furthest places in the former Soviet Union. Sometimes it was the desert. More often it was in the far Arctic north, with terrible temperatures. These camps were established usually by the prisoners themselves. They were exiled there. This is something that happened throughout Russian history, actually, but in the Soviet Union it was more industrialized, and the prisoners had to build their own camps in many cases, and many people died. And when I started, I started studying Russian. I lived and worked there, and for me, the Soviet history was something. I felt it everywhere. But for most of my Russian friends, it was something. Again, as I said earlier, something. Yeah, okay, fine, it happened, but it was a long time ago. Or sometimes the phrase is, "Well, it never happened, but it's a long time ago anyhow." And sometimes they say, "It never happened." Well. It was a long time. It was a long time ago, but it never happened anyhow. That's the phrase. It was a long time ago, and it never happened anyhow. And then these days, there's a comma behind it. But if you insist, we could do it again.
Oh my God.
So I got fascinated by these places. I mean, any kind of most aspects of the concentration camps in Europe are, if you find them, they're documented, they're institutionalized, they're museums, they're excursions, and in Russia this is the complete opposite. And I think there's a few pictures I can show you of some of these Stalinist prison camps, so parts of the Gulag, they're just there in the snow. Sometimes there are no roads leading to it, so I had to rent like a 4x4 vehicle to drive to such a place. And it's still there as it was. It was deserted late after Stalin's death, and there's no commemoration, there's no memory, there's no indication of what this is, what this means. And some of the places, because of time and because of snowfall and temperature, some of the watchtowers have collapsed. And then, of course, there is an attempt, and there was an attempt in Russia to document this, to at least open the archives, figure out what happened, and this was actively frustrated by the state, by the government, ever since I would say day one. But in the 90s, there have been some pretty good attempts to do that, and they were step by step. They were being frustrated. They were being the people who were working on that were being arrested. First, they were being harassed, and they're being arrested. And some of the people who research camps are now in camps themselves, often the same camps, by the way. So what fascinates me about it is that there is an attempt to do this. So if you go to the Russian Far East, around Magadan, so many of these camps were built around there. There's a regional museum in Magadan, and the museum has a permanent exhibition on the Gulag, but it's temporarily closed. And it's been temporarily closed
For 30 years.
for around 30 years. So there is an exhibition, and there's some stuff they found, there's some tools, and there's some narrations, some stories, but it's not accessible anymore. And so this was something I still can't fathom. You know, these are places where literally some of those places, tens of thousands of people perished there, and it means there's no way for relatives to because it's also so geographically far away. I mean, you need to fly for 10 hours to get there, and then drive for a day and a half through the snow. But there's no commemoration of that, and I found that fascinating. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe this isn't alive. Maybe this is not there. Maybe they really don't care, and they want to really move on somehow. But then I found that if you look very carefully, if you start asking around, people do care, obviously. Even in a deserted place like this, I mean, this is actually in Perm, but it doesn't matter. I found in Magadan, near one of those sites, I found a handyman, a loodgieter, so who works. He fixes the pipes and the toilets in that small village, in the small settlement. But because he works with the tools, he has an interest in tools. So he knows that those camps were built by those prisoners who had to manufacture their own tools. So he started collecting those tools. And he made a small exhibition in his own home. And he started collecting more and more and more. And then his wife at one point told him, look, I don't need to have all this camp memorabilia in our home. So he started putting them in his garage. And then his friends were interested, and his other people were interested. And then the director of the local school said, well, actually, that's fascinating. You have a garage with an actual historic exhibition. Yeah. So the history somehow is alive, but then obviously what happened in Russia, and this is already 15 years ago, the authorities arrested him because you're not allowed to make your own private little Gulag museum. And the school director who said it was a good idea for the kids to go there was laid off, etc., etc. Even if for me, it was an interesting case because at least it gave me a small understanding of I was inclined to say and to think that, okay, they really don't care because it's been diminished, because it's been wiped away and it's gone. But there is some interest, even if the state actively, it finds a way. Not anymore by now, but it did back then.
Yeah, but so you're writing down a note. What thought did this story spark?
Yes, because actually I wrote down experience because I think that's an important aspect or concept that we need to talk about in relation to history. Because what I said, I know that I said I'm critical about the notion of history as a concept, but what I meant is that actually how history is written and how people experience history, there's a difference and a gap between the two. So it's important to keep that what we experience is not always ending up in history or the same way as we experience it, at least. So that's important. The second thing is that in this case, for example, in the Gulag, so thanks for bringing this, I think much of the unwriting of history happened also because of the second and third generations of victims or survivors, whatever you want to call them. Actually, the relationship to the people or the fathers or the mothers, the victims of the Gulag, was very much determined by the notion of shame. So the notion of shame actually hindered this kind of writing of experience. So it's important to, unlike the Holocaust, for example, the Holocaust, this gap between the parents and the Auschwitz victims, for example, was always marked by a different form of identification, the gap was there, but it has compelled a different kind of strong identification. So every kid identified more closely with the experience of their parents, let's say, or their victims. So you see the dynamics are a bit different. That's two different processes, but it gets worse, Because actually some histories, you mentioned, now people talk about oral histories. So there's something called oral history as a discipline even. And also there's other kind of histories that were silenced, for example. So think about for our own colonial heritage in the Netherlands. For example, everybody knows about Balie and Jaffa, but very little people know about Lombok and the massacres that happened in Lombok. That kind of chapter doesn't even come in our Dutch history. So this is an example of how sometimes history is also silenced or oppressed. We don't want to remember it, hidden. Or also, sometimes it gets much worse when we talk about people who are not allowed to have history, so denied history. Like there's so many people who are not allowed to write histories. Think about the Palestinians, for example. We had to, the people in Palestine, they had to learn the history of the Egyptians or the Jordanians or the Israelis. But they never were allowed to have their own history. So that's a different kind of dynamic. The same happened in many other societies. So I think the notion of power is also very decisive in how we conceptualize, but also understand this notion of history. So that's why I wrote down experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's also something I realized
Yeah.
when I was working there, when I was literally walking around those camps. I was with a photographer, a brilliant Russian photographer, and you know, we discussed what's going on and why is this what it is and what does it mean. And I used to look at Soviet history as you know, as if the people I saw around me were victims of that. And my photographer just started laughing, and he said, no. The victims are gone. The victims died. The people who survived are the perpetrators. And the people you meet around you are the sons and grandsons and granddaughters and daughters of the perpetrators. Because I mean, again, the geological aspect of it, so the people that guarded those camps, they lived there as well. You could also say that they were, you know, victim in parts of that too. But yeah, why is nobody in Magadan, the city, the contemporary city of Magadan, talking about the Gulag? It's because, you know, the concept of shame is not only present in victims or in their generations afterwards, but especially, obviously, also in the perpetrators.
So would you say the absence of history there also changes reality on the ground?
Also the absence of, yes, and also the absence of any form of reconciliation. I mean, my favorite example used to be, and you'll get soon why I say used to be, the comparison was always with the Stasi in Eastern Germany. So if during that time in the 70s or in the 80s, if you worked for the Stasi, then in current day Germany, you're not even allowed to teach at a kindergarten. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, if you work for the KGB, for the secret services, or if you worked anywhere there, let's say, then of course it's a ticket to the presidency. So that was usually an entry to saying, oh, Germany is one of the very few countries that can only deal with its own history. The past 3 years have shown a little bit different, but of course. So you know, there's the history is written by those that won it. But like this, I mean, I found it. I used to look at these sites and the people around it as victims, and this experience led me to realize that actually they're not only victims. Mm. In fact, most of the people who survive atrocities are not the victims. That's why they're atrocities.
That's very chilling. And we'll get to victims and perpetrators in a bit. Eva, I think I want to ask you a question now. And of course, you're also welcome to comment. But on a personal level, you have experienced the Yugoslavian wars. What is it like, the experience of a post-war society?
Yeah, good question. I have to start by saying that I'm actually really privileged that I lived in Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, which was, in comparison to many other places, affected less. So what I experienced from the war is kind of a collapse of a society that I knew. My middle-class parents that had nice jobs, we used to go to the theater and the cinema, and all of that collapsed. All of a sudden, everybody was broke. Our parents were so scared and had no bandwidth to do a lot of stuff that parents often do. So you just didn't go to the dentist for 5 years because your parents were working 12-hour days to make money in a collapsed economy. But even then, I think I was quite lucky. So I don't consider myself a victim or a survivor. I consider myself as someone who lived in a society that was unlucky enough to be affected by a war. And in terms of what is the post-war experience in the former Yugoslavia, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, it varies massively depending on where you are. In Zagreb, if you come from a middle-class family that recovered, it's actually pretty nice. Like, it's kind of Vienna vibes, Central European kind of place. And if you walk around Zagreb, it's not actually something that you would even think about, I think. But it's enough to go 100 kilometers to the south to notice places that are depopulated, where very few people remain. Some of them were ethnically cleansed by the Croatian army, so the local Serb population was expelled at the end of the war, or left because they felt uncomfortable with staying. So it very much depends. Like, it depends if you speak to somebody in Sarajevo, if you speak to somebody in Srebrenica, if you speak to somebody around the town of Prijedor, for example, in Bosnia, where a lot of the concentration camps were. So it really massively depends on where you are, and simply, as many other things in life, what are your family circumstances, your financial environment, and things like that. So I think that is really very difficult to talk about at the level of, the former Yugoslavia or even Croatia as such.
So I guess you describe it in a very physical sense. There's economic collapse, etc. How about reconciliation?
Right. So I have to say that I'm probably in the minority on this. I don't particularly like the term. I don't like the concept. And it comes from my experience of living in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's not a critique to anybody in particular or this question. And I think it's a completely legitimate question. And again, I think I stand a bit on the side of most of the sort of debate. I lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina for several years in the early 2000s. I worked in investigations and prosecutions of mass atrocities, and I remember speaking to people that told me a couple of things about why reconciliation actually is kind of something that maybe should not be suggested. One of them is that they would say reconciliation is something that happens between people that had a fight, where are equals, and so that's one. They would say, reconcile with whom? They came to my door in the middle of the night. They took my dad with a gun to a camp. They raped my mom, took all my stuff and set my house on fire. Who exactly do you want me to reconcile with? Secondly, reconciliation, I think, really fundamentally depends on an acknowledgement of harm. If you deny that your community, a unit that you were in, did that to me and my community, how am I supposed to reconcile? Yeah. So I think it comes from a nice place, but in the former Yugoslavia, we had a legion of Westerners, nice Canadians, Swedes, Swiss, Dutch people telling us to reconcile, and I lost my mind because how can you ask me that? How can you ask, not me personally, again, I was very lucky, but if somebody took my dad to a camp, tortured him, ruined my life, and made me leave the country with a plastic bag, I'm sorry, that's an arrogant thing to suppose. So I think reconciliation can happen at an individual level between neighbors who come back to the small village, and I'm like, do you have an egg? Sure. Do you have some sugar? Sure. You know what I mean? Like at a very intimate level. But I don't think it should be prescribed. I don't think it should be expected from people whose lives were ruined. I just think it's an unfair, kind of an unrealistic thing to kind of demand, like, you should now reconcile. We in the former Yugoslavia were on the receiving end of a lot of that, and I think it just pisses people off, I think, for good reason.
Is justice then left at the courts?
No, because justice and reconciliation are two different things. Reconciliation is we're okay again, right? And they would say, like, I was never not okay with anybody. They came to my door with a gun, right? So I think legal processes, and I think we're going to get to that, can contribute to what I would call a normalization of relationships in communities. But calling it reconciliation, I think, is prescriptive. It's I think also a bit arrogant to demand other people that suffer to be like, no, but you reconcile. No, you reconcile. What are you talking about, right? So I think it's really important that some measures can be taken to help it, to help society recover, but to be like, hi, I'm from Sweden, how about you reconcile? I think it's a bit, no injustice to the Swedes, I'm sure they mean well, but it can come off as like, you know what I mean? Like it can come off as sort of like, you don't know what you're talking about a little bit in terms of life experience, you know?
Please, Ihab.
Yeah, I think I fully understand and respect what you're saying, but I think this also leads us to a different problem in relation to history, and that shows actually how history comes with certain traumas. And the problem with trauma is not that it's the past. The challenging part about trauma is that how you deal with trauma in the present. Or even when it's happened recently, or the present is a wide scope, let's say. But it gets much harder actually when you talk about the ongoing genocide, for example. Like how can you talk about reconciliation or any kind of these kind of stories when people are being killed? You're asking the victims to reconciliate with the sword, let's say, the neck and the sword. And I think we already learned the lesson from the French history of Frantz Fanon, the whole Argian episode, etc. So,
what was that history?
It was basically like a very bloody history that many people were killed. And Frantz Fanon already taught us these theories about the whole relationship between victimhood, etc. Oppression creates resistance, and that's the bottom line. There, you can't dream of anything else. Any other kind of, like the text what your friend was reading just now at the beginning, any kind of, sorry, I forgot that. I told you I forget. But I think any kind of peaceful dialogue or peace terminology that is being thrown in the middle of a massacre does not make any sense, because actually without approaching or achieving justice, it's very difficult to bring people to peace. People can forget and can forgive, but only after they have justice. It's very difficult to ask somebody who is experiencing injustice to forget and to forgive. And I think also maybe a critical notion in all these kind of processes is the notion of the pain. The idea
But before
of
we
the
get
pain.
there, what is justice to you?
Good question. Yeah,
that's why I asked it.
No, justice is basically, in this case, because we are talking about, of course, that's an abstract notion, and if we need to look at it from a contextual framework. So if we're talking about, for example, a national struggle, then you need to go back to this context and see that. So for example, if you talk about Palestine, the whole idea of settler colonialism, what is justice about bringing foreign people to a different country and saying this is their own land? This is not justice. And then you expect the native and the people of the land to recognize the invaders or the occupiers and to make peace with them. I think this whole process needs to be seen in a contextual framework. Justice as a general value doesn't have any meaning, actually, you see? But justice is basically returning the right to its own people. That's how the simplest notion, I think. So I didn't mean it in a kind of abstract term, but I think what I'm saying is that we need to look at the context itself, and to see where we can actually draw the line of what is something and where's the definition starts and where does it end.
I think that gives a very important task to journalism as such. In journalism in general, there is a tendency to, I mean, of course, we simplify things, and there's a we in general we are programmed in such that everything wars are bad and it's good when it's over, which is true. But of course, you have to ask yourself how and under which conditions and what does that mean. And we are kind of destined, and I see a lot of journalism these days that's kind of the ideal story. What any editor would like to see, what most journalists would love to make these days, and it's a mistake we still make. We'd love to see a Russian and a Ukrainian together on the stage. Wouldn't that be nice? They can make peace. They can talk about each other, and then we feel super great. I'm afraid in some institutions you even see this with Israel and Palestine these days. You can see it in a few years ago there was I think the city of Aachen has a prize for literature, peace prize for literature. I don't know. It was awarded to a Russian writer, fairly so, fantastic writer. And then the jury said, it would be great. So they have the prize, the literature prize, and they do a prize for the best illustrator as well. And of course, they selected the Ukrainian illustrator. Oh. That would be great. They should be on stage together. And the Ukrainians said, "Fuck that shit. Sorry, I have enough Russians in my life. I don't want another one, even if it's a good Russian or a bad Russian." So it just goes to show that. So there's two things here. There's a tendency in media. So I'll put on this burden that we want to simplify things and we really like things to be over because it's already complicated enough. So we are very much bended towards like, okay, great, now it's done. Trump doesn't bomb Iran anymore. Great, that's done. And it's, of course, never done. And these stories don't end, but our attention span ends. And that's a bad thing. That's something I always try to keep in mind when doing my work. And the second is, of course, this touches perfectly upon what you just said. It's the Western perspective of, putting a Russian and Ukrainian or an Israeli and a Palestinian on stage and saying, well, you guys now, sort it out, which is ridiculous. And I'm very happy that this is, we're in its last stages of that, or at least I hope.
And that's what I call emotional cleansing.
Emotional cleansing. Here we go. Could you?
That's basically that we all are creatures who want actually things to feel good about ourselves. This is make me feel good. I go to bed and I think, the world is not that bad. You see, while actually I still know that the world is very bad and still people are being murdered and slaughtered. So I think this whole idea also relates to our own agency as human beings, but also as citizens. I think the idea is that when we don't see the headlines that there's bombing here, etc., then we feel all good. So let's talk about the heat in Amsterdam today or something like this. Or No Puntanel is a good example of how this kind of news making or news reporting, do you call that history? I think that's the most ridiculous history ever made. You know what I mean? So I think it's important to engage in a serious fashion, because after all, we're not talking about who we are or what are we doing now. We're talking about matters that actually had to do with people's lives. And that's very important. Otherwise, what is the meaning of what we do as a teacher, as a journalist, as a...
No, that's a very fair point, and we'll get to, I guess, I don't want to say... But no, I'm not going to say that. Political cleansing, but it sounds a bit weird.
Emotional cleansing.
Yes, I know, but we were going to the political solutions for this later. But first I want to move to remembering or forgetting. So basically how we process these traumas. And the American-Israeli scholar Omar Bartov has argued in Genocide, the Holocaust in Israel-Palestine, that Israel should fold the Nakba, so the mass expulsion of Palestinians, into its own collective memory. So a state-enforced remembering and acknowledging, therefore. And the sociologist Eva Illouz responded to this, that memory entrenches wounds, actually, and that what Israeli society should do is some sort of politics of forgetfulness, a state-designed forgetfulness, and maybe even forgiveness, she states. So, Eva, I want to start with you. You've spent your life thinking about atrocity as a historian, and you've documented these crimes. Why do you think it's important for them not only to be documented, but to be remembered, if you think so?
Right. I absolutely consider it vital that things are remembered. Here as well, there's selectivity, and this is actually also something that, for example, people who live and work in Bosnia and Herzegovina will know. There are so many places of massacres, detentions, torture, abuse, rape. You cannot possibly remember every single one of them at the national level, because then all you would ever do is mourn. And that's also probably not healthy for a certain society. That's one thing. I think secondly, also when it comes to memory, and this will be recognizable for people in different contexts, is that memory is politicized. It serves a certain purpose. In a country that I come from Croatia, it uses, and this is not only there, but it's used as a way to legitimize the nation, legitimize a war that was fought in a certain way. So these are all potentially dangers that some of these atrocities can be instrumentalized in ways that is maybe not fair for the victims, is maybe not a sort of how we would want them to be. But maybe on the notion of forgetfulness, I frankly think it's completely preposterous to suggest in the context of Israel and Palestine to say that it's time to forget. No. It's time to set the wrongs right and then achieve some form of justice. And I think here, just coming back to the question about what is justice, justice is to a certain extent also in the eyes of the beholder. Some people in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia-Herzegovina will say, oh, I want somebody to go to jail. Some of them want high-level people like Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, Netanyahu's, Putin's, whatever. Some other ones want, no, I want the guy who beat the shit out of me in that camp on that Tuesday to go to jail. Some will want, I don't care about the prisons, I don't care about punishment. What I want is reparations. Some other wants, I don't care about anything. I just want to know where the bones are of my son so that I can bury him and then die in peace. So it's very difficult to say what is justice. You ask 1,000 people and you will get 1,000 answers. But what is certain is that some justice, something must exist. And I think if there is a role for some forgetting at some point, okay, we can talk about it. But I think what is necessary first is the acknowledgement of harm, the righting the wrong, right? If something is wrong, then we need to right it first to make it better, fix it, then talk about it, vent our grievances and anger and sadness, and then maybe at some point we'll be at the forgetfulness, but we can't forget without ever doing anything before. So I find the whole idea, especially in the context of an ongoing genocide, I think is really kind of preposterous. Absolutely.
Ihab, so Eva commented on, I guess, possible conditions for such a politics, and how do you reflect on it?
The issue of forgetting.
Yeah.
Before that, let me comment on what Bartov actually said and why I think it's important, not just his acknowledgement of the Gaza Holocaust.
Yes, could you please sit a bit closer?
Yes. Sorry, now I noticed the difference. I was too relaxed. But I was actually, I wanted to comment on what he said. I think his perspective is very important exactly because it's coming from a Jewish, East European, white Israeli. So this is a kind of very, trustworthy, important insight, let's say. So I think this acknowledgement, I appreciate all what he said about that. And I just want to go back now to forgetting. I think human beings are by nature creatures who forget. That's why we are human beings. We forget. So eventually, I don't want to dismiss forgetting. I think what Eva was saying actually is that it's possible to forget, but once the conditions actually have been made in order to facilitate that forgetting, as long as oppression or victimization continues, or trauma continues, it's very difficult to ask people, oh, forget about your history or your oppressor and move on. I think this is also should be put into kind of perspective because, as I said, every remembrance has part of it forgetting. So that's also what do I remember, what I don't remember.
You're selecting.
You're always selecting. I select to remember Mozart. You don't like Rembrandt, but okay. I want to remember Mozart. He's French, right? No, okay. You don't like that, okay. But I select this episode and I forget that episode. So this is all what we call, selective forgetting. That's Nietzsche's notion. So I think every process of remembrance includes that selective forgetting. So it's healthy to have that, and we need to forget actually in order to continue our lives.
But isn't that a private process that you're describing?
Yeah, but
and
that's
she's
what
arguing for some sort of state-enforced.
Yeah, that's what I'm wanted to get to. The whole idea of teaching people about their own dark history is very important. It's not just acknowledging, but also you need to recognize that and to identify that. You need to understand that, for example, yeah, sorry to say this, but I think the Dutch are not that innocent, nor the Portuguese are, nor the French, nor the German, etc. Nobody is innocent, you see, so you can't say, oh, we were the victims and we are the absolute victims. So that's why I think we need to discuss this whole notion of absolute victimization and absolute perpetrations. I always promote in my work the whole idea of the duality of this perpetrator-victim. Basically, the victim can be a perpetrator and vice versa, and the perpetrator can be a victim. The whole idea of the Holocaust, for example, that emerged with us in the past 80 years, relied on this notion of absolute victimhood. And now we see what happened in Gaza. So this whole idea of, I don't know if you want to show them the slides, so you can do that. But this whole idea of the genocide, for example, was legitimized by this whole idea of victimhood. So I think maybe it's good also to pay attention not just to what history is, not to what trauma is, but how certain processes are weaponized. The weaponization of certain pain or certain victimhood episodes in our history, that also creates another kind of massacres. Oh, you put this slide.
I
okay?
didn't.
Yeah, well, this is exactly what I was referring to, like the difference between the suffering of the Jewish people in Auschwitz and all these camps, and how these kind of experiences were weaponized by Zionists. So this is important to understand what kind of ideas are being circulated. This is not new. Actually, what you need to understand is that Israel today identifies itself with the Holocaust, right? Or at least claims it. What you need to understand is that before this guy, Menachem Begin, in 1978, the whole Holocaust victims were seen in Israel as human debris. They didn't want to recognize these Jews. They were seen as the weak Jews. These are weak Jews, we don't want to identify with them. Only in 1979, when Menachem Begin was into power, he actually embodied that into the whole biblical narrative of Israel as we hear today on the news. Before that, it didn't exist. So it's important that people know these things, that this is not a long history. This is, like we're talking about, what, 35 years, 45 years ago? Before that, it's like history was totally different. So what I wanted to bring with this example is that also that people seem to forget that actually Zionism was already voted by most of the world or all the countries as a racist ideology. So, and now we need to discuss whether Zionism is good or bad. I think it's a bit insane to go into this kind. All these historical resources and documents exist in front of us, but it depends on what you want to know. So what I want to say is that sometimes you need to go back again to the context and see where you can draw the line of what you define as proper knowledge, not proper knowledge, but also proper history and not proper history.
And then when we go back to that history, atrocities that happened, are there certain atrocities that are unforgettable? It's a question for anyone. Because the reason Illouz brings this idea up is against these fixed identities, because they might cause cycles of violence that repeat themselves, but are certain things just in its core unforgettable?
Can I ask a complementary question? As an answer?
Yeah.
Can we ever have a shared history? Is there any notion of shared history possible? Like, can you have a shared? Can you share? Can the victim and the perpetrator share the same history? Can the killer and the murdered share the same history? it's very difficult to share the same trauma. So I think that's a banal element. We need to acknowledge the situation in its own context and actually say things for what they are. Otherwise, we are going into circles of just making sense of the insensible. And I think that's a waste of time and energy of everybody, honestly. So that's why I think we need to focus this discussion toward, okay, what is possible? And not just to go for easy terminology like let's make peace or politics is not peace. You see what I mean? So it's like human relations do not depend on 5 members of the United Nations sitting on a circle table and saying veto or yes or no. Or I think that's a problem with the international law as well, that we need international law more than ever, but we also need to recognize or to be critical about the whole idea of international law more than ever. Because why international law when it comes to a country like the Netherlands? I have a right as a citizen, as a taxpayer, etc., and everything. I can live by that. And why other people in Africa can't have that?
Let's go there now, actually, international law. So yes.
Let me. Sorry, if I can I stop that, interrupt that for a second, because the question is like, can you ever have a shared history? Is very interesting. And when I was asked to join this panel, I had to think for a long time. Can I find any form of reconciliation that actually went reasonably well? I'm sorry to say that I found only one, and that's on the island of Cyprus. So on the island of Cyprus, of course, there was a war in 1974. The Turks invaded the island after the Greeks had organized a few atrocities. And currently, it's a divided island, and this is the only place. I think we have some slides we can show that where I saw a story that impressed me immensely, where they do the following. There's a project where there are still people lost. So there were soldiers and civilians murdered, and nobody knows where they are. So there are some mass graves, usually not that big, but the people are lost, and relatives don't know where to look for and where to find them. So there's a project where, because of course this is already nearly 50 years ago, there's a project where if you are old and you are dying, researchers and investigators come to you and they ask you to tell on your deathbed if you have anything that you're willing to share, which you were maybe afraid or ashamed to say. And this works. People and the promise is that this will only be investigated
once you're dead.
Once you're dead, yeah. So people confess to certain crimes there. Indeed, yes, we came into this village, we murdered 12 civilians, and we dumped them in the well. And then after these people die, they dig open the wells and they find and identify, of course, with the help of DNA, etc., etc. So the remains that they dig up in these excavations are brought to the neutral UN zone, which is right in the middle of Cyprus, between the Greek and the Turkish part. And there's a laboratory there where they are being determined, investigated, the DNA samples are found, and the family members are only informed once one person has been found on both sides. So once a Greek and a Turk have been found and identified, then they invite and inform the families, and they invite them to a common funeral. And suddenly these people, and I think, this is the laboratory we were seeing, and suddenly these people realize, holy moly, the pain I've been suffering for all these, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s of years, the pain is the same on the other side. Again, there's not much hope and light in this world, I'm afraid, especially not nowadays, but this is the only example of a project where I found, and I spoke to a lot of the people that went through this process. They were informed that, indeed we have found your father, your grandfather, and they managed to create even lasting friendships with people on the other side of the island.
And what does that tell you, that shared pain? You were talking about the notion of pain. Eva, what do you think?
On the one hand, great. On the other hand, if it was my family, I would find it very sort of patronizing to, you know what I mean? Like to be told how I'm allowed to commemorate my, no. But I also see very much that maybe this is the only opportunity for people to meet. And indeed, we have these sort of civil society initiatives in the former Yugoslavia. And indeed, mothers of, people that were taken away and killed often they will say, oh, what I feel is the same as this mother. We mothers have the same experience. So that, I think, really does work. But I do also at the same time have the problem of like the state telling me how I'm supposed to bury my dead father. You know, like, I'm sorry, no. So I have mixed feelings about it. But again, I think in these kinds of times, we do need to be creative, because often in the aftermath of dictatorship, war, conflict, people will indeed live away from other communities, so they might never, for example, Bosnia-Herzegovina is quite divided, so people will simply like not meet necessarily to be able to establish organically these kinds of, so mixed feelings, a mixed bag.
Because there's this element of the state telling you how to mourn, but then there's the second element of no legal repercussions. How unique is that?
If I may, this is my life's work. Actually, impunity is actually the norm. And this may seem unusual, because especially in the kind of in modern times, we hear the language of international law being used constantly by people who are not lawyers. And that also makes me always a little bit sort of, because I get asked by journalists, in the past couple of years, sometimes twice a week, is international law dead? And I'm like, well, in some ways, okay, I can see the skepticism. In some other ways, international law is more alive than it has ever been before. We see in classrooms, in governments, in civil society, in the street, in the cafe, online, everybody using the language of international law. Is there genocide or not? People talking about courts, people talking about various proceedings at the International Court of Justice, about the occupation, the advisory opinion, South Africa versus Israel. So in many ways, international law is more alive than it has ever been before. So it also is a matter of sort of like what we choose to kind of see and pay attention to, which is not to say that these institutions function beautifully or that our states are not hypocritical. They are. They apply double standards. We've seen this with Ukraine and Palestine very clearly. But I don't think that that's the reason to say, oh, international law is dead.
So yesterday we had another very esteemed guest at the Balie, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, and he had something to say about international law.
What did he say? Maybe you can update us.
So he was here to talk about the future of human rights, basically, and he said that successful resolution of conflict is at its lowest in 2026. And basically that states don't really abide to it anymore, and the way they go about waging war is just all ends. The means justify the end, basically. That's what he said. So, how would you respond to that?
I think he's probably right, but I think we also need to be very specific about what exactly do we mean. Do we see international humanitarian law, which is the body of law that governs behavior in armed conflict? Is it okay to shoot at a hospital or not? So that body of law, I do think that it's clear that it's deteriorated, that states less and less.
But is the body of law deteriorating, or are the wars just not suitable? For the body of law
is not, it's an abstract. So the law lives in the action of states and in the action of people. So the body of law is not doing anything. It's being applied or not applied by states and by soldiers and commanders and alike. But I think in many ways as well, we critique all of these institutions that are interested in investigations and punishments. At the same time, in the last 5 years, we have seen the International Criminal Court's prosecutors go after Putin, who is head of state at the P5, so a veto-holding member at the UN Security Council, never happened before, go after Netanyahu and Gallant and possibly others, Smotrich or Ben-Gvir as well, which are Western allies. So we critique these institutions, but at the same time, they're daring to do stuff that 20 years ago they would do to Yugoslavs and Rwandans. You're going to get punished, but not our buddies, not our friends. So, they're trying. These institutions are trying. And I think the flaw is primarily with states that decide. Their militaries decide, oh, we're just going to shoot up those hospitals. Like international law itself doesn't do anything. It needs to be applied or not applied, right? By institutions and by soldiers in the field. So I think it's a more complex picture than like, is it failing or is it succeeding, right? There's a lot of layers to it and a lot of different institutions and bodies of law that we could be discussing separately.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
What should we do to ensure that it succeeds more?
Well, I think this is something that my students ask me all the time. So I think one of the things that we can and should be doing is, which I think is very familiar to probably everybody here in this room, is call out bullshit when we hear it. For example, when our new prime minister that came in said, oh, we hebben begrip voor the US-Israeli attack in Iran, we're like, excuse me, what? Because that's like a super illegal invasion.
That was basically the consensus in Europe.
Yeah, and so sorry, but no begrip voor, because that's, so I think that's a very easy low bar thing that we can do. Secondly, we try to elect a government that suck a little bit less, right? So all of these kinds of things are something that we all can do. And I actually have seen, we had the Rode Line protests. Yeah. We have a lot of engagement of journalists. We had protests at universities. So it's not hopeless. It's not, we talk, I've been on conversations like this, journalists call. So it's a conversation. And that, I think, already signals that it's not a lost battle. Because if nobody talked about it, if nobody cared, if nobody protested, then, if no prosecutions or arrest warrants came for Putin or for Netanyahu or guys like that, then we could be like, it really sucks, nothing is happening, oh, it's all dead. But it's not dead. It's, things are happening. But what the problem of all of this is politics. It's not law. The law is not great, but it works if you want to apply it. The problem are the politics of it, right? So that's, I think, that's the place where we need to direct our efforts, I would say.
Problem, politics, what can we do? Engagement.
Yeah.
Ihab, how do you think about this?
Wasn't that Francesca Albanese, the commissioner, or the human?
No, she's the rapporteur, and this is the commissioner,
okay,
human rights commissioner. Yeah.
Yeah, he's right about this, but there's an explanation for this, which we actually seem to forget about. That the whole change of the dynamic of the war before the Second World War or after the Second World War, the whole dynamics of the war became actually a war against civilians. We used to have army against army. But now, actually, the whole war dynamics is actually targeting civilians, and that's thanks to United Nations. We allowed that for many years in Rwanda, in other places, in Srebrenica, and so that has been going forever. But the whole war, for example, how do we make war, is actually targeting civilians. So it's not even targeting armies. They don't destroy military infrastructures. They destroy hospitals, houses, neighborhoods, etc. And not just in Gaza. Gaza just showed us how that is done. But this is the dynamics. And I think I agree with you that the whole idea of politics is becoming a problem. And we as citizens, that's why we are talking today. We need actually more awareness on our sides, on our rights as citizens, and also for all of you young people, also as taxpayers. We have a right to demand things from our politicians. We basically hire them to do this job. So don't forget that, and they can listen and they can come after me, but this is the truth. This is in the Constitution. We have a right to ask them to listen to us, because actually what's happening today is that there's a lot of distrust in this whole political system. And the problem is that I'm not crying for the political system. The problem is that we don't have any alternative to it at the moment. And the only alternative to it is the jungle law. So where do we go? I would like to hear this prime minister or that prime minister or even the next prime minister, what they are going to say, God forbid, if the Germans come back here. Yeah, I'm sorry, but these are questions you think this is maybe insulting or disrespectful, but these are realities. Imagine any other country powerful than us. We don't have any army, we know that. Comes and invades the Netherlands. Who is going to stop them?
Who is going to stop them?
Yes.
Olaf?
I think the European Union within 3 days will issue a statement that they're very concerned. Who's going to stop them? Mick Jagger wrote a line saying, "What after all, it was you and me." I don't know. I'm still thinking about. The point you make is very, very valid. Wars these days are directed against civilians, and that changes the whole perspective of it. And you can see that. Obviously in Gaza, I saw it. Last week. I was in Lebanon. I talked to a lot of rescue workers. These are people that work on ambulances. These people are targets. If you are a healthcare worker, if you drive a fire truck, the enemy knows that if you kill a healthcare worker, you
have an impact.
You have
on
an
the broad
impact. You have a
community,
direct impact because you kill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in a convoy, etc. But you also kill a whole bunch of other people that can't be saved by these very rescue workers. Exactly. In the east of Ukraine, there are no more ambulances driving around to the front line because they know they're a target. So the ambulances are. We used to paint cars into ambulances. Now we repaint the cars back into normal cars. Because a red cross is a target. And that's a massively problematic development. And wars are fought, and it's bad enough. But if indeed all the wars turn against civilians, I think we're lost. And I think this is a very important point to keep pointing out. If we, the destruction of infrastructure is for civilians. Of course, theoretically, an ambulance could carry some ammunition, but it probably doesn't. A bridge could carry a car that might carry ammunition, but it's used to transport people from A to B. And it's the destruction of civil infrastructure, where it's and the specific targeting of civilians, whether it's in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Lebanon, and other places, in Iran by the Americans. The war in Iran started with the Americans bombing a girls' school. Yeah. And we tend to kind of step over that and talk about the dynamic of the war and what it means and stuff. But first and foremost, we have to realize that we live in a time where, unfortunately, violence is directed at civilians. And it's I very much agree with the point you're making. Don't ever assume that violence is somewhere far away. Oh yeah, we're very lucky that now it's far away, relatively to us, although it's creeping closer and closer. But there's no guarantee, and especially in this day and age, that it will not come towards us.
That's what we Yugoslavs things. We had the same. No, there's not going to be a war, and then there was. Yeah. So
I really do not want to end on this grim note.
If I may add one last thing, because this is also important. Because if people turn these kind of discussions into religious divisions, like Jews against Muslims, against Christians, or any kind of ethnicity, Protestant against Catholic, etc., I think this is when it becomes really a very sensitive and very important, annoying misunderstanding or kind of propaganda that is at work. I think it's really important.
And what function does that propaganda have then?
It has what I call actually philo-Semitic McCarthyism. It's actually pretending that we love the Jews, but actually they use this whole notion of the loving the Jews. If we have neo-Nazi parties who claim now, all these populists, I don't know what, who claim that they do what they do because they love the Jews. I think if you care about Jewish life at any level, then you should stand up and raise your voice against these kind of things that are happening. Because what's happening in Gaza is most dangerous for Jewish lives. And I think we all need to speak out in order, if we care about Jews, then we really need to speak out against that.
I think it's time to go to the public now. And are there any questions? I see some hands raised.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been so fascinating. I would like to get a comment from any of you about how those in power weaponize conflicts from the past in order to push forward nationalist propaganda. So, for example, regarding the conflict in Kosovo, the Serbian government uses the Bath of Kosovo in 1300 and something against the Ottomans to propagate the need for Serbian supremacy. That's just one example. So conflicts from the past are kind of like you have that selective thing again, where they're selected in order to push an agenda. And I think we're seeing that quite a lot. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. Thank you.
I think most of you could comment on it, but Eva, maybe you could take a start.
Sure. Well, I think there is no scenario. I'm sorry, I'm not it's really weird. So I'm kind of speaking behind. Behind me. But I think there is no scenario in which memory is not political in this way or the other. It just might be some politics that we do not like. But because the crimes are political, right? Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, these are legal categories, but these are essentially atrocities. They're political in what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to get rid of a group, they're trying to claim a territory, get some resources, make sure that somebody's not there, whatever. So I think in that sense also any act of remembrance, how we remember, who we invite at the commemoration, what is the flag that we use, what are the speeches that we use, it's always going to be political. And it's always going to be in one way or another sort of potentially used for some political purposes. I think the Battle of Kosovo is a pretty radical example. It's like 800 years ago, so that's pretty, you know. But in that sense, I think it's used as a sort of historical backbone for a territorial claim, and I think we should sort of understand it as such. But again, I don't want to single out poor Serbia. I think this is something that actually happens quite a bit, that, you know, we pick out things for history that serve our narrative that we will then use in some way to justify whatever we want to achieve. I hope that's helpful.
A second question.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the very interesting conversation. I had a question tying into the last discussion that you had about international law and apparently the fact that after the Second World War, wars are mostly directed against civilians. I never thought about it this way, but it does, for me, gives a stark contrast with the fact that our body of international law was developed after the Second World War and is mainly like mainly developed in order to prevent this. So for me, it begs the question all the more whether international law is a paper tiger or not.
They lied to you, I would say. No, it's a great paradox, actually, because we started this international law exactly for this goal, while actually the whole mechanism depended on this kind of dynamics. I don't think this means that we need to dismiss international law. I think, as I said, we don't have any alternative. We are in lack of a theory of a system. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there is no alternative, like which supermarket do I buy international law from? We don't have a theory for it, you know, like we don't have an academic scientific theory for a system that can actually govern. Like our social contract, we know what happened with, what's his name, our funny guy? The social contract party. The whole social contract, no, the original one I'm talking about. The social contract, we don't have any system for that or any theory for that. So the best option we have is the current international law. So that's why we don't need to dismiss it. But we need to realize, okay, maybe this moment can be also constructive and productive in order to think about critically how we can improve this international law.
Do you have any ideas of that yourself? Possible improvements?
No, I think that's her job.
Thanks, not a problem.
I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah. No, but if I may, I can just say one or two things. I absolutely agree that international law is the system that we have. And imagine we say, okay, you know, toss it out of the window. Who is going to negotiate a new set of rules? What, Trump and Wilders and the people like that? I mean, you know, or Farage, if he comes to power in the UK. We have what we have. And I also agree that actually moments of disaster, or at least, you know, multiple crises that we have going on right now, have historically been extremely generative. After the Second World War and the Holocaust, we had a massive amount of international institutions and international documents, human rights conventions, genocide convention, Geneva conventions established. The fact that sometimes they are broken, I mean, in the domestic sense, when a murder happens in the Netherlands, do we say, oh, domestic criminal law is dead? No, we don't. We say somebody murdered somebody, and that means that the law is broken. But that doesn't mean that the law does not exist. So I think we also should adapt our language. Law is being broken. It's not that it doesn't exist, right? Robberies happen, and that's illegal, right? So I think we also need to be a little bit more realistic about what we actually expect, you know? International law is not magic. It's not going to end wars and end violence, and it's one tool that we have in this, you know, imperfect toolbox to manage relations between states and peoples and sort of to negotiate problems between states and society. So I think we should also be a little bit aware that it's not like a magic wand that you wave, oh, the violence is finished, you know, occupation has ended. We need political will for that. We need pressure for that. Political action, not some imaginary sort of wand that comes with international law solves all the problems.
And reform as well, like the whole form of the
Security Council,
United Nations and these 5 people who determine our lives. Yeah, that's clearly something that we need to reform. Why the English and the French and who else? The Russian and the Americans and the Chinese. Why not other people? Why not Burundi or Suriname or Curacao? I don't know what.
They're not a nuclear state. Sorry. Let's go to the third question.
Thank you so much for all your contributions. I wanted to tie something Olaf was saying to what Eva was saying and ask you about the importance and the scholarship on illustrations. So Olaf made the point that, the KGB is like route to the presidency and the issue of perpetrators in the Gulag. But what does scholarship tell us about the place of illustrations in the normalization of relations and the end to wars?
Do you want to start?
Look, I enjoy very much listening to both of you, so I think that's much better if you apply. I think we need to, for the audience, it's good to specify what illustrations mean.
Yeah.
So, well, I'm not going to do that, but I mean, it means that after a certain change of power, then the people that are held responsible. That's basically what it is. Correct?
I mean, they're kind of cleansed out of government service.
Yeah. They're held responsible, or they're fired, or get another place, and the new system is in place, and kind of does that. How important is that? It's a very good question.
Right. I don't study that specifically, so this is going to be a bit of a vibes-based answer. But my sense is two things. First, that it doesn't actually happen that much. In the former Yugoslavia, it didn't happen. I think also, like in post-Second World War Germany, at some point they were like, oh, we don't have any judges, so we need to let the Nazis come back, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I think it's something that is important, but actually I don't think regularly happens. And secondly, I think while I understand where it comes from and that it's a good idea, at the same time, there's a real fear that it would be used for revenge that is unjustified. And, people can also say, well, of course I was working in a repressive system, but like they were threatening my family. So it's much more complex, I think, than people can say, oh, it's just easy, right? I think it's very complex as a process. And I think people that sometimes work in some of these jobs could be like, well, it was my livelihood. Like if I didn't work at, you know what I mean? Like if I didn't work at the Ministry of Internal Affairs, what would I do? I was a small cog in the machine, right? So I think it comes from a good place, but I think to actually implement it fairly and justly and constructively is maybe more difficult said than, more difficult to do than it is to sort of think of it.
Do we have any good practices?
I don't know, but again, I don't study this, so I don't. It's our collective assignment to go home and try to figure out if there are good examples.
No good examples, but other examples, like what happened with the deportation of the Jews from the Netherlands. The same arguments were weaponized actually to cover up these kind of deportations.
Right.
Like the Dutch are innocent, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Okay, then.
I was just wondering if a lot of this to me seems to come down to politics and very weak politicians, especially now in Europe. What do we think about that? Isn't that why nothing's really happening? Because it's all about business and money and deals and not about what is right or just?
So morality and weak politicians.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting concept. I think it's shifting slowly, but especially in the Netherlands, we have a tendency to think that politics and everything else are two different things. So politics is the stuff that happens in The Hague, and then the rest is, life, business, whatever. But we don't see the politics in everything. The best example is sports. It's changing slowly, but there is a general conviction that, politics is politics and sports is sports. Just let the people play soccer or let people sing a Eurovision song. Who cares? But these events, especially the world of football, sports, organized by corrupt regimes around the world, it's very political. So I think what lacks a little bit is an understanding of how political everything is. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think we need to realize how political. I mean, look, this phone is political by so many means. I can't even start and don't know where to finish because it's probably made by Uyghur forced labor in China.
With minerals from the Eastern Congo that are built into it, right?
Exactly. So violence. I mean, okay, not only violence, but politics is everywhere, and we need to realize that politics is not just a segment of 2-3 minutes you see in the news. It's not just 2 or 3 pages in the newspaper, and it's not just what you see in The Hague or in Brussels or anywhere else. It's everywhere.
Politics is everywhere, Ihab.
No, but I think it's also a moral question. It has to do with our morality. I think every culture produces what it deserves. So if you're complaining about weak politicians, yeah, we created that. We gave them our values gave us this culture. We tend to think that political culture is just falling from heaven. No, we make it. We have agency for that. And that is a representation of our morals, of our values, of what we think is important, what we think is not important, what we think is right, what we think is wrong. So these things are actually our own doing without realizing this. I just want to say one more thing, that for example, during the COVID, etc., we gave a lot of our privacy rights to the government, etc., but with our own hands. So actually, yeah, you can complain that you don't have a lot of private freedoms, but you did that with your own hand. You gave willingly, you gave your own freedom away. And I think it's about really high times for the people to take over their lives. I think we see that in economy, etc., and I think we pay for that. We have a right to do that. I'm not promoting for a popular revolution, but I think, please don't misunderstand me, but I'm saying is that we need to change our own selves in order to change our own present, or our own reality. Without that, it's very difficult, and I think the hope should be focused with the future generations, because I really think that's where one of our biggest problems in society today. If you look at the quality of the schools, the level of the schooling, or the knowledge that we, with all the invasion we have with social media and how knowledge is being circulated, I think this is really doesn't look good for the future, and we need some policies that address these kind of issues as soon as possible. Things, yeah, I'm optimistic, but things, need a lot of work still.
So let's end with cautious optimism then.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't expect that. Could you please give a last hand of applause for my incredible speakers?
Thank you. Thank you.
So if you're really lucky, you might find them at the bar to ask some questions you didn't dare to ask here. And that's it for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.